We are welcoming everyone today. This is our third session of the Beginning Care Farmer series, and it is great to see you all here. We really appreciate you taking the time tonight to attend and for your interest and curiosity about care farming. I'll introduce myself. I'm Kate Mudge. I live in rural Minnesota, and I work as a contractor with the Care Farming Network. And I'll be facilitating today's session. And you'll also see Andrea and Woody on from Care Farming Network too. And so as we move through today's session on facility and land options for a care farmer, you may have some questions that arise. So I want to make sure that you know that we have one more upcoming session in this series. That's going to be next Wednesday. How do I fund a care farm is the topic. And we've also done two previous sessions that are both have been recorded, as is tonight's session. And you can find those on our website under the events page of Beginning Care Farmer series. We link to all of the recordings after we have them, and then we also link to a resource list. You may also notice that we're focusing these sessions on farms that are located in the Northeast region of the United States that serve individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities. And that's because the Care Farming Network received support from the National Institute of Food and Agriculture through the USDA. And this grant is going to help us do a whole lot of things, including this series. But we also hope that even if you're not located in the Northeast region or you serve a different population, that these sessions are really going to be helpful to anyone involved in care farming in any region serving very diverse populations. So whether you have land already available for a care farm or if you're in the early stages of searching for land, today we're going to explore how you get started in that process. Here is just an overview of what we're going to be discussing. We have a session that's about 45 minutes long, and at the end, like all of our other sessions, we're leaving about 15 minutes open for question and answers. So if you have any questions, you can certainly throw them in the chat and we'll address them at the end of the session. So we're talking about facility and land options. And first and foremost, location. Where are care farms? And you can find care farms in rural areas, you can find them in urban areas, and you can find them in suburban areas. We've got some examples here. Philly Goat Project, located in the heart of Philadelphia. And they provide opportunities for urban residents to connect to nature in a really novel way, using goats for engagement and education and building community. And you also have an example here of Growing Solutions Farm. They're a little over an acre, a produce farm located in Chicago, and they support public high school students who are with autism, who are transitioning out of high school and are looking to gain vocational skills. So rural care farms, I would say, are more the norm and are really well represented through the Care Farming Network. Homestead Farm Center is just one example, located in West Virginia. And if you visit our map, you can actually see just how many care farms there are out there. We have a map that actually lists the location of the more than 200 care farms we've identified in the United States so far. Then we also have examples of suburban care farms. One example here is Red Wiggler Community Farm, located in Germantown, Maryland, kind of offering a farm setting, not quite rural, not quite urban. So today we're going to be talking about what aspiring care farmers should be considering and differentiating between those who have access to land already and those who are in kind of the land seeking stage. And we're going to begin with people who are looking for land. So some issues come to mind. You're going to need to develop a list of needs for a care farm. You are going to need to identify resources for land access. And there's some decisions to be made about whether purchasing or leasing land is the right option for you. So if you're looking for land, here are just a few considerations to think about. How much space are you going to need? Where are you interested in being located? And is there transportation, including public transportation or parking? Have to think about your infrastructure needs and your access to your local community. Obviously, cost is a big issue. The land capacity of what you can put or house or how people are going to visit a farm, and accessibility in general for those who might be needing special arrangements to safely access and get around your farm. So there's a ton of resources that are available to search for available farmland. On the left here are just a few of the options. And you can also reach out to regional or statewide organizations that might offer additional land search services. You can connect with a local real estate agent specializing in listing agricultural lands. And just a reminder, we are going to have a list of organizations that help aspiring farmers find land on the resource page that we're sharing after this session. Here's just two examples of LandLink or FarmLink county and state farm sites. Sites like these, here's one in Minnesota and here's one in Montgomery County. They allow land seekers and landowners to post either land that's available for sale or lease in hopes of making connections between landowners and land seekers. So just a reminder that your region might have something very much like this. So you're considering, or you're needing land and you're considering, do you lease or do you purchase? And when weighing the options between leasing versus buying, there's again considerations to take into account. Your budget, the local community, what are your programming needs? Do you need personal living arrangements? The ultimate goals of your care farm should all be considered. And again, there are a lot of online tools that can support you in working through these questions. This is one example of Acquiring Your Farm, which is offered by Land for Good, which is a free online tutorial for aspiring and beginning farmers preparing to access farmland. They offer lessons organized around 7 topics, as you can see, and they're designed to provide a thorough introduction to the complex issues of farmland access. And there's also a farmland assessment guide that can help you examine site conditions and variables that can affect the viability of your farm. It's kind of intended to compare potential farm properties or leasing opportunities. So once again, we're going to have links to these in the resource page that we're sharing out with you. So there's also alternative models to leasing and buying farmland. You can partner, for instance, with an organization in your community and actually help them create a farm program. There are also options to lease space from other organizations or entities, such as Parks and Rec or county land, in kind of a hybrid public-private partnership. And we're going to hear more about that later from Woody at Red Wiggler. The point here is to be open to all options and to explore your alternatives. As I just mentioned, Woody here is the founder and executive director of Red Wiggler, and he has a really innovative lease arrangement. In 2005, Red Wiggler Farm moved to its current location on Ovid Hazen Wells Park in Germantown, Maryland. And they have a public-private partnership with the Maryland National Capital Park and Planning Commission, in which they lease the 12 acres and serve over 1,900 community members through their CSA program. And when you're looking at lease agreements versus buying, you can see that there's some pros and cons. If you're leasing, it's obviously quicker to start. There's less investment up front if you're going to lease land, and leases can be, shorter term, maybe 1 to 5 years. It also allows you to pilot test your ideas. And again, it's not a big upfront investment. And some of the cons is with leasing is there's less control and less strings attached. I'm sorry, for purchasing. I'm getting all mixed up. There are cons to leasing as well, and those are listed here. So you have less control. there's going to be a landlord and there might be some strings attached with your lease. You also may have to vacate with short notice. And it can be really difficult to make long-term investments on leased property. For owning land, if you're in a fortunate position to own land, there are still many decisions to consider when starting a care farm. So, zoning. Just because you're doing a good thing doesn't mean that your local community is going to change zoning laws. So, here's some of the zoning issues that you have to be thinking about. If you're going to have animals, you have to think about what is the maximum number of animals that you'd be allowed per acre. What kind of animals can you have at your property? What farm activities are allowed or not allowed? What setback laws might be required? Are there a certain number of dwellings that are allowed per lot? And who are the decision makers? Who are in charge of the zoning laws and also the variances in your area? So you may start out wanting to raise chickens and end up raising goats or pigs. And that's fine if you've picked the right property to begin with, but more difficult if zoning or other restrictions allow for chickens, but say nothing else. So make sure that you find out exactly what you can and can't do. And this is in terms of livestock and fencing, and you're building additional structures. And you need to ask these types of questions. Bear in mind, though, that zoning laws can be changed, and your property's zoning status can be amended through something like a proposed zoning or land use change. Different municipalities, townships, cities have different names, but it's initiated by either property owners or the municipality itself. And this can work in your favor. It can also possibly work against you. For instance, if your neighbors have issues with your operation. And the lesson here, reach out to your county and local representatives. They are here to serve you. And the more information that you have about zoning laws and how they're applicable to your operation, the better served you are. So in general, having a really good relationship with your neighbors is important. Yet in care farming, it's probably even more important because we've heard from plenty of established care farmers who've shared their stories of their neighbors or maybe people in their communities who have concerns about being a neighbor of a care farm. So this is why it's so important to talk with your neighbors, to explain your mission, how you'll be a good neighbor, and to allay any misplaced fears they might have. So insurance. On-farm activities require insurance above and beyond standard liability coverage, usually under some kind of maybe commercial business policy. And the extent of coverage depends on specific risks, such as like the frequency of visits that you're having to your farm, also what types of activities are occurring. And as with any insurance, it's critical to understand exactly what's covered, the cost of the policy, and the level of exposure. And there are a lot of types of insurance one may need. A lot of this depends on the types of things that you own, how you operate, or who visits. You're probably familiar with general liability insurance. Directors and officers insurance is specifically for nonprofits, and that protects board members of charitable organizations. Other examples of insurance are endorsements that might modify your existing coverage. There are many examples of that, such as adding an additional person to your policy or adding coverage for specific activities, such as horseback riding is an example. And umbrella insurance is a type of personal liability insurance that can cover claims in excess of the limits of your standard policy. So to be absolutely sure that you're in compliance with your state laws and to mitigate risk on your farm, we highly recommend that you consult a legal professional, find a local insurer, and you might need to actually consult with a specialist, someone who offers insurance who's really familiar with either nonprofits or agriculture entities. So put it in writing. If you have legal agreements, they should be created if there's any kind of partnership at all between a landowner and an organization. And these agreements should outline things like your lease rates, again, what activities are allowed on your property, what activities are not allowed on your property, and the arrangement between the owner of the property, the lessor, and the tenant, the lessee. An example of a good lease agreement is Full Pocket Farms in Virginia. They operate both a nonprofit entity and an LLC on their property. And they host farm-based social and educational events through their nonprofit. So they went and created a lease agreement with the LLC branch of their farm. Gail from Full Pocket actually was a guest on our session too and talked a little bit more at length about this. So if you haven't checked that out, might be worth viewing for you. Gail from Full Pocket mentioned that when starting out, they recommend that agreements, they don't have to be full of jargon and legalese. They just simply need to be clear. And their advice, if renting from a friendly landlord, is to clarify all potential issues: finances, parking, public events, access to water or the well, again, the structures, the livestock. Sometimes there's issues with smell and things like access to the bathrooms or to porta potties. So understanding your farm's space is really integral to a successful operation. And as you develop your farm, there are some key things for you to be considering. This has been mentioned before. I'll mention it again. Parking. Where will people park? Is there room for larger vehicles, such as buses, if those are in your future? When people arrive, are routes clear? Is parking well marked? Do people know how to get to you? And then we have bathrooms. Do you have them? If you do have them, are they ADA compliant? Do they need to be? Signage. So do people know how to find you? Does your website or your social media page provide clear instructions for how to get to your farm? Oftentimes mailing address is different from your physical address. So is that clear for people? And if you're in a rural area, again, is it clear where people can come and find you so they don't go accidentally visiting your neighbors? Farms also provide numerous physical dangers. So just thinking again about risk mitigation, have you identified them and have you thought through where people should have access to and where people should not have access to? For anybody working or visiting your farm, accessibility. What specialized accommodations might they need? And similar, public transportation. Is your farm accessible for those who do not drive or who use public transportation? And if public transportation isn't available, what other options are? We've heard about Care Farms offering shuttle services, for example. And we're hearing more and more people who are operating care farms who are talking about climate control, because with all of the crazy weather that we've had and most likely will continue to have, where do people go if there's storms or if there's excessive heat or other weather related issues? So think through protected or covered shelters too. So like we're doing in all of these sessions, we're talking to care farmers and we're asking them, how did you acquire your land and facilities? And how has your setting, whether you're in a rural or suburban or urban area, influenced your farm? And so Jen from Little Otter, excuse me, Little Otter Flower Farm shared that they bought the land and built the buildings and that they're in a rural area, but only 3 miles from the center of town. And it's nice to be really close to town for a number of reasons, but there's no public transportation. And that really has been a huge issue for getting interns who are not part of the school program. John from Langton Green in Annapolis shared that the setting was one of the biggest factors in the suitability for their choosing their site. That it's really central to the homes of most of the participants. And again, transportation is typically cited as the primary problem in providing services for their community. It's also situated near a large number of suburban communities, and they benefit from access to a local program, which is focused on sustainable ag. And Jenny from Homesteads for Hope. Location, all caps. When planning your care farm, think about transportation for who you serve. Think about your access to community. Who's your customer base? Homesteads for Hope is in a rural town, but on a major road and only 10 minutes from a major city, so that works. And that has offered them, a lot of support from their town and a lot of opportunities for collaboration. And back to Full Pocket, Gail says that it was really important for them to be rural, but the proximity to an urban or suburban population in order to get that transportation for participants and attendees was important, and also just to be a resource in their county. This slide is some advice from Martin Fisher. He is the director of the National Federation of Dutch Care Farms. And he said, when starting a care farm, it's not always necessary to make large investments immediately. For example, you can create a vegetable garden with few resources and creativity. Participants can help manage the farm, and you can guide them in small groups. But if it turns out that your care farm is already attracting more participants, you can gradually think about investments, such as a group room for the participants, where you can also offer maybe indoor activities in case of bad weather, and where you can use for breaks and lunch. To get an impression of what resources and investments you will need as a minimum to get started, it's really highly recommended to visit several different care farms and learn from those who have been in your shoes. So in the spirit of sharing, we've been doing this in all of our sessions, and we're having somebody speak directly to the issues that we've kind of already covered here to tell their own story and provide their advice and insight. So I want to introduce Woody, the founder and executive director of Red Wiggler Community Farm. And he's just going to walk us through what considerations and decisions he had to make when starting and operating Red Wiggler. So welcome, Woody.
Thanks. And yes, that's my picture there. So with respect to zoning, when I got here to Montgomery County, Maryland, I didn't really know it. However, it turned out, happened to land in a very agriculture friendly community. And it had the reputation for its agricultural reserve, which we were a part of. But I think it's very important to, that may be the case, the reputation is one thing, but you really have to dig into the details. Because there are other care farms and entities in our farm entities in our county who have run into problems when they've tried to do creative things. So if you feel like your county's like that you're looking at it, or your municipality is super friendly, dig deeper is my advice. And really meeting early and often with your the people, I want to say lawmakers, but really they're your elected officials, your local elected officials. In our case, we have council members. And they approve the county budget annually, and they know the rules and regulations and what's possible and what's not. And the thing is, there's not a county council person in our area that is gonna like be negative about what we do. But we have to recognize that there may be roadblocks. And so those folks and their staff and it should not go unsaid that the staff are the ones that really do the work. You do need to win over the you know, the face of county government, but those offices that they have and the people that work in them are your real friends. Next slide. Insurance. So this is one of those cases where you really can't get going without 100% coverage. In our case, when we started, we were incubated by a friendly family who leased land to Red Wiggler and to me personally, actually, in the very beginning. But they said, hey, you can't get going without proper insurance. And fortunately, they shared with me their insurance provider because they owned a number of businesses in the area. And so in speaking with that insurance provider, I ended up with a general liability insurance policy with the family named as additional insured. Now, if you all are the landowner, I highly recommend that you create a lease between yourself and the nonprofit, if that's what it is, or the LLC, but just underscoring things previously said, having things in writing, insurance is the umbrella policy first, naming different entities as additional insured, and then of course, if you're a nonprofit, you have to have directors and officers insurance. And next slide. And the reason I hesitated there was directors and officers is not something too scary, but it does have a price tag. Roughly, it's generally around, I'd say probably these days, $1,500 a year to protect your board members. Space and considerations. In the very beginning, when we got going, we just landed in a place that didn't have much public transportation. It was in a rural area. We were very lucky because at that time, the social service agencies serving people with intellectual and developmental disabilities had a robust transportation system internal to their organizations. Over time, many of those social service providers for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities have been getting out of transportation and allowing public transit to drive sort of transportation. In our area, we have Metro Access, which is a federal program. That's mostly likely due to that there are 1.1 million people in our county. But otherwise, understanding like where you're going to be, perhaps, I know it's crazy to think, but like where are you going to be in 10 years? And is that space adequate for the growth that our culture sort of foists on us? Perpetual growth. Year over year, you know, we're encouraged by our funders to grow. So you have to have space to grow in. That said, getting started, like Red Wiggler got started in a small, almost like a handshake agreement with a piece of paper behind it. But ultimately, we ended up having to move to a location that was had more space and more accessibility. Next. So in our case, after being housed on private property for really somewhere between 7 and 9 years, there was some overlap, which is why there's a discrepancy there. We did when we were on private land, and then we did this work to create a partnership with our park system here in our county. And when we did that, I made sure that there was overlap. There was actually 3 years of overlap so that we could transition. But the public-private partnership, or PPP, is a thing, and you can Google it. You have to set it aside from the, what was it, the PPP from the pandemic. But these are great relationships. Some of the more progressive counties are very interested in public-private partnerships because they allow nonprofits to utilize underutilized properties. And I have to say it's very important, if you go in, if you do the work to create one of these agreements, make sure that there's a renewal clause. It doesn't have to have a lot of teeth in terms of we will, or the legal terms are whether you will or whether you shall. In our case, our renewal clause is dependent on our performance. So fortunately, we perform well. Next slide. Oh, neighbors and community. Yes, this is something to always be aware of, is that, as Kate had said earlier, you may be doing a great thing and a lot of people back you on that. However, when it gets to be the backyard of a neighbor, you really have to do the work to make sure they're comfortable with what you're doing. And a lot of that is just make sure that they know what you're doing. Because if you don't tell them, they're just going to be guessing. And as the bullet says, hyper local outreach. So really, we're talking like within a mile radius of your location. Or if you have to expand it, you do. But look at churches and talking with them. They're very receptive. Clubs like the Lions Club. Civitan is a great one. Any number of clubs, but make sure you connect and share your information about what you're trying to do or what you are doing. It really needs to be done, and you need to carve out time to do it. Next slide. Oh, I'm not sure how I feel about this one. They interviewed me and they wrote this quote and I approved it because it's sort of true. And I think that a lot of the reason I allowed them to leave this in there, Kate and Andrea, is that I want you to understand that you guys are doing the footwork ahead of time. I don't know where you are in your process, but it can be overwhelming. And there's no way that you can do all the things that we're suggesting. And really, had I known then, I really would have been overwhelmed. And I'm not sure, given my maturity level 27 years ago, that I just would have been scared. So what I want to say to everyone is, don't fall into that trap. Just because anytime you educate yourself, you increase sort of all sorts of, voices that can come in and say, in the back of your head, I have no business doing this or whatever. Every business that's ever started has felt that way at different times. Just know that you're preparing yourself and you're learning the vocabulary, that you're learning the issues, and stick with it. And then I think there's a couple of slides later, rely on us as a Care Farm Network. We can do a deep dive into whatever your particular issues are. We're speaking very generically here, but we've learned all sorts of things from different folks that we've consulted with over the past, really, mostly the past 5 years. We've seen some successes and we've seen some challenges. And, I think there's a network now that you can rely on, and peers in your region through the map that you can rely on. So please do not feel overwhelmed. Maybe you will, but, try to keep even keel, and more power to you. Next slide. Yeah.
Thanks, Woody. That was like the perfect setup here. Yes, we did leave that slide in because I think it was somebody in the last session where we're asking everyone to do an evaluation, and one of the questions was, what topics do you want to see addressed in the future? And somebody recommended starting with fear was the topic that they wanted to see. So we put that in there as a understanding that this is not easy work, and clearly it's doable because there's lots of people out there with care farms and more in the queue that are ready to do this. So our intention is to say to be both optimistic as well as realistic around all of the different steps that it takes to get from A to Z. But this is a plug for Care Farming Network because our intention here, beyond providing more awareness about care farms, is to connect and build community. So as Woody mentioned, both Andrea and Woody are out there doing consultations, either online, over the phone, on farm, really focusing specifically on what it is that you aspiring care farmers want to know and learn from others. So just a wealth of information that they have. And we're here to connect you with others too. The generosity of spirit and sharing amongst care farmers, I find absolutely amazing in this network. And if you're looking to raise goats in a rural area and you have a question about insurance, I bet we can find somebody to talk to you about how you do goat yoga on your care farm on Sundays. So lean on us. As I mentioned before, we also have the interactive map where you can find other farms and do a search. There's a filter option in there that's pretty cool. So if you want to search by population served or kind of what people are offering or region, you can do that. And we're continuing to build out our organizational resources. We do have a Facebook discussion group. It's a easy way to post a question and get real-time feedback from other folks. So find us on Facebook. There's a couple questions that you have to answer because it is a closed group, but that's there too. So as I mentioned at the top of the session here, we have one last session next Wednesday. This is probably the question that we get asked the most, which is why it's its own special topic about funding a care farm. So register for that if you haven't already. And as I mentioned before, we are grant funded for a lot of this work. And with grants come reporting. And with reporting comes evaluation. So this is just a plea ahead of time to please, I think Andrea just threw it in the chat. It's a very short evaluation for you to take. It wouldn't take probably even 5 minutes. Just to tell us, is this information that we're providing helpful? We're looking at these evaluations after every session and figuring out what could be done better because our whole goal is to make this easier for everybody and to provide resources in a really good way. So we appreciate ahead of time if you were to take a little bit of time out of your day to do that evaluation. So with all of that, I think we're going to stop the recording, and now we're a little bit ahead of time, but we have some time for Q&A, and there's people with knowledge on this call that are here to answer your questions, whatever they might be. I haven't